Hello, everyone. Good evening. Tonight we're going to read Chapter 6 of The Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman. Yesterday we finished Chapter 5 and read the interlude. Chapter 5 was about the dance macabre. It's a dance when the dead come down from the graveyard and the living are mesmerized by music and they dance together. It's kind of a big party. But afterwards, the living have no memory. And then the interlude showed a little bit more about the man Jack, who is some sort of assassin, and he has some kind of association of assassins that he's affiliated with, and they're giving him a hard time about not completing the contracts for the killing of Bod's family and Bod. So, let's read Chapter 6. Nobody Owens School Days. Rain in the graveyard, and the world puddled into blurred reflections. Bod sat, concealed from anyone, living or dead, who might come looking for him, under the arch that separated the Egyptian walk and the northwestern wilderness beyond it from the rest of the graveyard, and he read his book. "Dammy!" came a shout from down the path. "Dammy, sir, and blast your eyes when I catch you. And find you I shall make you rue the day you were born." Bod sighed and lowered the book and leaned out enough to see Thackeray Porringer, 1720 to 1734, son of the above, come stamping up the slippery path. Thackeray was a big boy. He had been 14 when he died, following his initiation as an apprentice to a master house painter. He had been given 8 copper pennies and told not to come back without half a gallon of red and white striped paint for painting barbers' poles. Thackeray had spent 5 hours being sent all over town, one slushy January morning, being laughed at in each establishment he visited, and then sent on to the next. And he realized he had been made a fool of. He had taken an angry case of apoplexy, which carried him off within the week, and he died glaring furiously at the other apprentices, and even at Mr. Horrobin, the master painter, who had undergone so much worse back when he was apprentice that he could scarcely see what all the fuss was about. So Thackeray Porringer died in a fury, clutching his copy of Robinson Crusoe, which was, apart from a silver sixpence with the edges clipped, and the clothes he had formerly been standing up in, all that he owned, and at his mother's request, he was buried with his book. Death had not improved Thackeray Porringer's temper, and he was now shouting, "I know you're here somewhere. Come out and take your punishments, you thief." Bod closed the book. "I'm not a thief, Thackeray. I'm only borrowing it. I promise I'll give the book back when I've finished it." Thackeray looked up, saw Bod nestled behind the statue of Osiris. "Told you not to," Bod sighed. "There are so few books here. It's just up to a good bit anyway. He's found a footprint. It's not his. That means it's someone else's on the island." "It's my book," said Thackeray Porringer obstinately. "Give it back." Bod was ready to argue or simply to negotiate, but he saw the hurt look on Thackeray's face and relented. Bod clambered down the side of the arch, jumped the last few feet. He held out the book. "Here." Thackeray took it graciously and glared. "I could read it to you," offered Bod. "I could do that." "You could go and boil your fat head," said Thackeray, and he swung a punch at Bod's ear. It connected and it stung, although judging from the look on Thackeray Porringer's face, Bod realized it must have hurt his fist as much as it hurt Bod. The bigger boy stomped off down the path, and Bod watched him go, ear hurting, eyes stinging. Then he walked through the rain back down the treacherous ivy covered path. At one point he slipped and scraped his knee, tearing his jeans. There was a willow grove beside the wall, and Bod almost ran into Miss Euphemia Horsstall and Tom Stans, who had been stepping out together for many years. Tom had been buried so long ago that his stone was just a withered rock, and he lived and died during the Hundred Years' War with France, while Miss Euphemia, 1861 to 1883, yet she sleeps with angels, had been buried in Victorian times, after the graveyard had been expanded and extended and become, for some 50 years, a successful commercial enterprise. She had a whole tomb to herself behind a black door in the willow walk, but the couple seemed to have no troubles with the difference in their historical periods. You should slow down, young Bod, said Tom. You'll do yourself an injury. You already did, said Miss Euphemia. Oh dear, Bod, I have no doubt that your mother will have words with you about that. It's not as if we can easily repair those pantaloons. I'm sorry, said Bod, and your guardian was looking for you, added Tom. Bod looked up at the gray sky. But it's still daylight, he said. He's up betimes, said Tom, a word which Bod knew meant early, and said to tell you he wanted you if we saw you. Bod nodded. There's ripe hazelnuts in the thicket just beyond the Little John's monument, said Tom with a smile, as if softening a blow. Thank you, said Bod. He ran on, pell-mell through the rain, and down the winding path into the lower slopes of the graveyard, running until he reached the old chapel. The chapel door was open, and Silas, who had love for neither the rain nor the remnants of the daylight, was standing inside in the shadows. I heard you were looking for me, said Bod. Yes, said Silas. Then it appears you've torn your trousers. I was running, said Bod. I got into a bit of a fight with Thackeray Porringer. I wanted to read Robinson Crusoe. It's a book about a man on a boat. That's a thing that goes in the sea, which is water like an enormous puddle. How the ship is wrecked on an island, which is a place in the sea where you can stand. And Silas said, It's been 11 years, Bod. 11 years that you've been with us. Right, said Bod. If you say so. Silas looked down at his charge. The boy was lean. His mouse-colored hair had darkened slightly with age. Inside the old chapel, it was all shadows. I think, said Silas, it's time to talk about where you came from. Bod breathed in deeply. He said, It doesn't have to be now. Not if you don't want to, he said it as easily as he could, but his heart was thudding in his chest. Silence. Only the patter of the rain and the wash of the water from the drain pipes. Silence that stretched until Bod thought that he would break. Silas said, You know you're different, that you're alive, that we took you in, they took you in, and that I agreed to be your guardian. Bod said nothing. Silas continued in his voice like velvet. You had parents, an older sister. They were killed. I believe that you were to have been killed as well, and that you were not was due to chance and the intervention of the Owenses. And you, said Bod, who had that night described to him over the years by many people, some of whom had even been there. It had been a big night in the graveyard. Silas said, Out there, the man who killed your family is, I believe, still looking for you, still intends to kill you. Bod shrugged. So? He said, It's only death. I mean, all of my best friends are dead. Yes, Silas hesitated. They are. And they are, for the most part, done with the world. You are not. You're alive, Bod. That means you have infinite potential. You can do anything, make anything, dream anything. You can change the world. The world will change. Potential. Once you're dead, it's gone. Over. You've made what you've made, dreamed your dream, written your name. You may be buried here, you may even walk, but that potential is finished. Bod thought about this. It seemed almost true, although he could think of exceptions. His parents adopting him, for example. But the dead and the living were different. He knew that, even if his sympathies were with the dead. What about you? He asked Silas. about me? Well, you aren't alive, and you go around and do things. I, said Silas, am precisely what I am, and nothing more. I am, as you say, not alive, but if I am ended, I shall simply cease to be. My kind are, we are not. If you see what I mean? Not really. Silas sighed. The rain was done, and the cloudy gloaming had become true twilight. Bod, he said, there are many reasons why it is important that we keep you safe. Bod said, the person who hurt my family, the one who wants to kill me, you are certain that he's still out there? Something he had been thinking about for a while now, and he knew what he wanted. Yes, he's still out there. Then said Bod, and said, then said Bod, and said the unsayable, I want to go to school. Silas was imperturbable. The world could have ended, and he would not have turned a hair. But now his mouth opened and his brow furrowed, and he said only, what? I've learned a lot in this graveyard, said Bode. I can fade, and I can haunt. I can open a soul gate, a ghoul gate, and I know the constellations. But there's a world out there with the sea in it, and islands and shipwrecks and pigs. I mean, it's filled with things I don't know. And the teachers here have taught me lots of things, but I need more if I'm going to survive out there one day. Silas seemed unimpressed. Out of the question. Here we can keep you safe. How could we keep you safe out there? Outside, anything could happen. Yes, agreed Bod. That's the potential thing you were talking about. He fell silent. Someone killed my mother and father and sister. Yes, someone did. A man? A man. Which means, said Bod, you're asking the wrong questions. Silas raised an eyebrow. How so? Well, said Bod, if I go outside in the world, the question isn't who will keep me safe from him. No, it's who will keep him safe from me. Twigs scratched against the high windows as if they needed to be let in. Silas flicked an imaginary speck of dust from his sleeve with a fingernail as sharp as a blade. He said, we will need to find you a school. No one noticed the boy, not at first. No one even noticed that they hadn't noticed him. He sat halfway back in class. He didn't answer much, not unless he was directly asked a question, and even then his answers were short and forgettable, colorless. He faded, in mind and in memory. Do you think they're religious, his family? Asked Mr. Kirby in the teacher's staff room. He was marking essays. Whose family? Asked Miss McKinnon. Owen's, in 8B, said Mr. Kirby, the tall, spotty lad. I don't think so. Sort of medium height. Miss McKinnon shrugged. What about him? Handwrites everything, said Mr. Kirby. Lovely handwriting, what they used to call copperplate. And that makes him religious because he says they don't have a computer and he doesn't have a phone. I don't see why that makes him religious, says Miss McKinnon, who had taken up crocheting when they had banned smoking in the staff room and was sitting and crocheting a baby blanket for no one in particular. Mr. Kirby shrugged. He's a smart lad, he said. There's just stuff he doesn't know. And in history he'll throw a little in little made up details, not stuff not in books. What kind of stuff? Mr. Kirby finished marking Bod's essay and put it down on the pile. Without something immediately in front of him, the whole matter seemed vague and unimportant. Stuff, he said, and forget it. Just as he forgot to enter Bod's name on the roll, just as Bod's name was not to be found on the school databases. The boy was a model pupil, forgettable and easily forgotten. He spent much of his spare time in the back of the English class, where there were shelves of old paperbacks, in the school library, a large room filled with books and old armchairs, where he read stories as enthusiastically as some children ate. Even the other kids forgot about him. Not when he was sitting in front of them, they remembered him then, but when that Owens kid was out of sight, he was out of mind. They didn't think about him. They didn't need to. Someone asked all the kids in 8B to close their eyes and list the 25 boys and girls in the class. That Owens kid wouldn't have been on the list. His presence was almost ghostly. It was different if he was there, of course. Nick Farthing was 12, but he could pass, and did sometimes for 16, a large boy with a crooked smile and little imagination. He was practical in a basic sort of way, an efficient shoplifter, an occasional thug who did not care about being liked as long as the other kids, all smaller, did what he said. Anyway, he had a friend. Her name was Maureen Quilling, Bud. Everyone called her Mo, and she was thin and had pale skin and pale yellow hair, watery blue eyes, and sharp, inquisitive nose. Nick liked to shoplift, but Mo told him what to steal. Nick could hit and hurt and intimidate, but Mo pointed him at the people who needed to be intimidated. They were, as she told him sometimes, a perfect team. They were sitting in the corner of the library, splitting their take of the year seven's pocket money. They had 8 or 9 of the 11-year-olds trained to hand over their pocket money every week. The Sing kid hasn't coughed up yet, said Mo. You'll have to find him. Yeah, said Nick. He'll pay. What was it he nicked? A CD? Nick nodded. Just point out the error of his way, said Mo, who wanted to sound like the hard cases from the television. Easy, said Nick. We're a good team. Like Batman and Robin, said Mo. More like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, said somebody who had been reading unnoticed in a window seat. He got up and walked out of the room. Paul Singh was sitting in the window sill by the changing rooms, his hands deep in his pockets, thinking dark thoughts. He took one hand out of his pocket, opened it, looked at the handful of pound coins, shook his head, and closed his hand around the coins once more. Is that what Nick and Mo are waiting for? Somebody asked. And Paul jumped, scattering money all over the floor. The other boy helped him pick up the coins and handed them over. He was an older boy, and Paul thought he had seen him around before, but he could not be certain. Paul said, Are you with them, Nick and Mo? The other boy shook his head. Nope. I think they're fairly repulsive. He hesitated. Then he said, Actually, I came to give you a bit of advice. Yeah? Don't pay them. Easy for you to say, because they aren't blackmailing me. The boy looked at Paul, and Paul looked away ashamed. They hit you or threatened you until you shoplifted a CD for them. Then they told you that unless you handed over your pocket money to them, they'd tell on you. What did they do? Film you doing it? Paul nodded. Just say no, said the boy. Don't do it. They'll kill me. They said, tell them you think the police and school authorities could be a lot more interested in a couple of kids who are getting younger kids to steal for them and then forcing them to hand over their pocket money than they ever would to be than they ever would be in one kid forced to steal a CD against his will. That if they touch you again, you'll make a call to the police, and that you've written it all up. If anything happens to you, anything at all, if you get a black eye or anything, your friends will automatically send it to the school authorities and the police. Paul said, But I can't. Then you'll pay them your pocket money for the rest of time in this school, and you'll stay scared of them. Paul thought, Why don't I just tell the police anyway? He asked. Can if you like. I'll try it your way first, Paul said. He smiled. It wasn't a big smile, but it was a smile right enough. His first in 3 weeks. So Paul Singh explained to Nick Farthing just how and why he wouldn't be paying him any longer, and walked away while Nick Farthing just stood and didn't say anything, clenching and unclenching his fists. And the next day, another 5 11-year-olds found Nick Farthing in the playground, told him they wanted their money back, all the pocket money they'd handed over in the previous months, or they'd be going to the police. And now Nick Farthing was an extremely unhappy young man. Mo said it was him. He started it. If it wasn't for him, they'd never have thought of it on their own. He's the one we have to teach a lesson. Then they'll all behave. Who? Said Nick. The one who's always reading. The one from the library. Bob Owens. Him. Nick nodded slowly. Then he said, Which one is he? I'll point him out to you, said Mo. Bob was used to being ignored, to existing in the shadows. When glances naturally slip from you, you become very aware of eyes upon you, of glances in your direction, of attention. And if you barely exist in people's minds as another living person, and being pointed to, being followed around, these things draw attention to themselves. They followed him out of school and up the road, past the corner newsagent, and across the railway bridge. He took his time, making certain that the two who were following him, a burly boy and a fair, sharp-faced girl, did not lose him. Then he walked into the tiny churchyard at the end of the road, a miniature graveyard behind the local church, and he waited beside the tomb of Roderick Person and his wife, Amabella, and also his second wife, Fortunia. they sleep to wake again. You're that kid, said the girl's voice. Bob Owens. Well, you're in really big trouble, Bob Owens. It's Bod, actually, said Bod, and he looked at them with a D. And you're Jekyll and Hyde. It was you, said the girl. You got the seventh. You got to the seventh formers. So we're going to teach you a lesson, said Nick Farthing, and he smiled without humor. I quite like lessons, said Bod. If you paid more attention to yours, you wouldn't have to blackmail younger kids for pocket money. Nick's brows crinkled. Then he said, You're dead, Owens. Bod shook his head and he gestured around him. Actually, I'm not, he said. They are. Who are? Said Mo. People in this place, said Bod. Look, I brought you here to give you a choice. You didn't bring us here, said Nick. You're here, said Bod. I wanted you here. I came here. You followed me. Same thing. Mo looked around nervously. You got friends here? She asked. Bod said, You're missing the point, I'm afraid. You two need to stop this. Stop behaving like other people don't matter. Stop hurting people. Mo grinned a sharp grin. For heaven's sake, she said to Nick, hit him. I gave you a chance, said Bod. Nick swung a vicious fist at Bod, who was no longer there, and Nick's fist slammed into the side of a gravestone. Where did he go? Said Mo. Nick was swearing and shaking his hand. She looked around the shadowy cemetery, puzzled. He was here. You know he was. Nick had little imagination. He was not about to start thinking now. Maybe he ran away, he said. He didn't run, said Mo. He just wasn't there anymore. Mo had an imagination. The ideas were hers. It was twilight in a spooky churchyard, and the hairs on the back of her neck were prickling up. Something is really, really wrong, said Mo, and she said in a higher pitched, panicky voice, We have to get out of here. I'm going to find that kid, said Nick Farthing. I'm going to beat the stuffing out of him. Mo felt something unsettling in the pit of her stomach. Shadows seemed to move around them. Nick, said Mo, I'm scared. Fear is contagious. You can catch it. Sometimes all it takes is for someone to say that they're scared for fear to become real. Mo was terrified, and now Nick was too. Nick didn't say anything. He just ran, and Mo ran close on his heels. Streetlights were coming on as they ran back towards the world, turning the twilight into night, making the shadows into dark places in which anything could be happening. They ran until they reached Nick's house. And they went inside and turned on all the lights. And Mo called her mother and demanded, half crying, to be picked up and driven the short distance to her house, because she wasn't walking home that night. Bod had watched them run with satisfaction. That was good, dear, said someone behind him, a tall woman in white. A nice fade first, then the fear. Thank you, said Bod. I hadn't even tried the fear out on living people. I mean, I knew the theory, but, well, it worked a treat, she said cheerfully. I'm Amabella Person. Bod, nobody Owens. The live boy from the big graveyard on the hill? Really? Bod hadn't realized that anyone knew who he was beyond his own graveyard. Amabella was knocking on the side of the tomb. Roddy, Petunia, come see who's here. There were three of them there, and Amabella was introducing Bod, and he was shaking hands and saying, Charmed, I'm sure, because he could greet people politely over 900 years of changing manners. Master Owens was here frightening some children who doubtless deserved it, Amabel was explaining. Good show, said Roderick Person. Bounders guilty of reprehensible behavior, eh? They were bullies, said Bod, making kids hand over their pocket money, stuff like that. Frightening is certainly a good beginning, said Petunia Person, who was a stout woman much older than Amabella. And what have you planned if it does not work? I hadn't really thought, Bod began, but Amabella interrupted. I should suggest that dreamwalking might be the most efficient remedy. You can't dreamwalk, can you? Not? I'm not sure, said Bod. Mr. Pennyworth showed me how, but I haven't really. Well, there's things I only really know in theory, and Fortunia Person said, Dreamwalking is all very well, but might I suggest a good visitation? That's the only language that these people understand. Oh, said Amabella, a visitation? Fortunia, my dear, I don't really think so. No, you don't. Luckily, one of us thinks. I have to be getting home, said Bob hastily. They'll be worrying about me. Of course, said the Person family, and lovely to meet you, and a very good evening to you, young man. Amabella Person and Petunia Person glared at each other. Roderick Person said, if you'll forgive me asking, but your guardian, is he well? Silas? Yes, he's fine. Give him our regards. I'm afraid a small churchyard like this, well, we're never going to meet an actual member of the honor guard. Still, it's good to know that they're there. Good night, said Bod, who had no idea what the man was talking about, but filed it away for later. I'll tell him. He picked up his bag of school books and he walked home, taking comfort in the shadows. Going to school with the living did not excuse Bod from his lessons with the dead. The nights were long, and sometimes Bod would apologize and crawl to bed exhausted before midnight. Mostly he just kept going. Mr. Pennyworth had little to complain of these days. Bod studied hard and asked questions. Tonight Bod asked what about hauntings, getting more and more specific, which exasperated Mr. Pennyworth, who had never gone in for that sort of thing himself. How exactly do I make a cold spot in the air? He asked. And I think I've got fear down, but how do I take it all the way up to terror? And Mr. Pennyworth sighed and harumphed and did his best to explain. He was gone 4 in the morning before they were done. Bod was tired at school the next day. The first class was history, a subject Bod mostly enjoyed, although he often had to resist the urge to say that it hadn't happened like that, not according to the people who had been there anyway. But this morning, Bod was fighting to stay awake. He was doing all he could to concentrate on the lesson, so he was not paying attention to much else going on around him. He was thinking about King Charles I and about his parents, of Mr. and Mrs. Owens and the other family, the one he could not remember, when there was a knock on the door. The class and Mr. Kirby all looked to see who was there. It was a year 7, one who had been sent to borrow a textbook, and as they turned, Bod felt something stab in the back of his hand. He did not cry out. He just looked up. Nick Farthing grinned down at him, a sharpened pencil in his fist. I'm not afraid of you, whispered Nick Farthing. Bod looked at the back of his hand. A small drop of blood welled up where the point of the pencil had punctured it. Mo Quilling passed Bod in the corridor that afternoon, her eyes so wide he could see the whites all around them. You're weird, she said. You don't have any friends. I didn't come here for friends, said Bod truthfully. I came here to learn. Mo's nose twitched. Do you know how weird that is? She asked. Nobody comes to school to learn. I mean, you come because you have to. Bod shrugged. I'm not afraid of you, she said. Whatever trick you did yesterday, you didn't scare me. Okay, said Bod. He walked on down the corridor. Wondered if he had made a mistake getting involved. He had made a misstep in judgment, that was for certain. Mo and Nick had begun to talk about him. Probably the year 7s had as well. Other kids were looking at him, pointing him out to each other. He was becoming a presence rather than an absence, and that made him uncomfortable. Silas had warned him to keep a low profile, told him to go through school partly faded, but everything was changing. He talked to his guardian that evening, told him the whole story. He was not expecting Silas's reaction. Cannot believe, said Silas, that you could have been so stupid. Everything I told you about remaining just this side of invisibility. And now you become the talk of the school? Well, what did you want me to do? Not this, said Silas. It's not like the olden times. They can keep track of you, Bod. They can find you. Silas's unmoving exterior was like the hard crust of rock over molten lava. Bod knew how angry Silas was only because he knew Silas. He seemed to be fighting his anger, controlling it. Bod swallowed. What should I do? He said simply. Don't go back, said Silas. The school business was an experiment. Let us simply acknowledge that it was not a successful one. Bod said nothing. Then he said, it's not just the learning stuff, it's the other stuff. You know how nice it is to be a room filled with people and for all of them to be breathing? It's not something in which I've ever taken pleasure, said Silas. So you don't go back to school tomorrow. I'm not running away from Mo and Nick or school. I'd leave here first. You will do as you are told, boy, said Silas, a knot of velvet anger in the darkness. Or what, said Bod, his cheeks burning. What would you do to keep me here? Kill me? He turned on his heel and began to walk down the path that led to the gates and out of the graveyard. Silas began to call the boy back, then stopped, stood there in the night alone. At the best of times his face was unreadable. Now his face was a book written in a language long forgotten, in an alphabet unimagined. Silas wrapped the shadows around him like a blanket, stared after the way the boy had gone, and did not move to follow. All right, I think we're going to pause it there, and I will try and read some more. Probably going to take a break tomorrow on Sunday so we can finish up on time with the end of school. Thank you for listening and reading along with me. I hope you're enjoying the novel. I certainly am. Take care of yourselves and your families, and keep reading. Have a good night.